Well, our top story today, hundreds, in fact thousands of people have attempted to flee Kabul after the city was taken over by the Taliban yesterday. Overnight, Taliban fighters patrolled the capital city after taking control of Afghanistan following its 20-year war. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is currently chairing a Cobra meeting to discuss the ongoing situation. And we have got, who we'll be speaking to shortly, our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, outside Westminster to give us the developments. With us now, though, is Afzal Amin, former officer in the British Army for 11 years, the last 3 of which were focused on counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. Thank you very much for joining us. It has been galling and so harrowing to see how quickly this situation has spiralled out of control. Why has that happened, and why at that pace?
Well, it's an extraordinary couple of weeks we've witnessed, there's no doubt about that. Your question as to why points to really why and how all wars end, and it's primarily to do with strategy. So the Taliban employed a classic insurgent strategy, which is that wherever the security forces appeared, they would disappear. And I often draw the analogy between Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham, where the merry men slip away into the woods when the sheriff's men appear, and when they need to ambush particular government coin and whatever, and gold, they can do that easily from the impunity of the woods. So the Taliban have had large areas of Afghanistan in which they can operate hidden amongst the civilian population. And over the last 20 years, yes, they've waged a guerrilla campaign against NATO forces that have been in almost all parts of the country. And in this last phase, I think we must recognize the strategic defeat that we seem to have suffered as NATO at the hands of the Taliban. And it comes down to they've overcome 2 particular weaknesses which they previously were hampered by. The first one is the geographical limitation of the Pashtun heartlands. The second one is not having alliances with non-Pashtun groups in Afghanistan. And in the last, I would imagine, a year or so, they've been negotiating across the country, expecting an American withdrawal, as Donald Trump had negotiated with them. And in anticipation of that, they had prepared a large number of people outside the Pashtun heartlands to work with them to stand up against the government. And that's why we saw this catastrophic collapse of the Afghan state structures.
So most people would agree that this has been a disastrous withdrawal.
Yes.
What would have been the best case scenario?
Well, that's a tough one, because you have to then link that to when are you asking that question and when are you expecting the answer. Yeah. So the best case scenario on September 11, 2001 would have been a counter-terrorism operation and led by international police forces, not an invasion of Afghanistan, distracted by the unnecessary crime of aggression with the invasion of Iraq, and then resources being used there and having to go back to Afghanistan years later to try and fight this insurgency that had come up. So at that time, a few thousand international Interpol-type people would have been the best solution. Once NATO got beleaguered in Afghanistan with this completely naive approach of trying to build a state in Afghanistan based on the Westphalia model of states, where you have the monopoly of violence within a particular geographical area centered on a capital city, which we have primarily European states, that idea could not work in Afghanistan. We heard names like Pashtun, Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara. So who are these people? So the Pashtun heartlands were cut in half by the Durand Line, when the British were ruling British India, and that split the Pashtuns between the Pakistan side and the Afghan side. The Tajiks, of course, are related to Tajikistan. The Uzbeks are related to Uzbekistan. So again, those remnants of empire that still play out within the state of Afghanistan. And then, of course, there's the Hazara community, who have been victims again and again of aggression from other minorities within Afghanistan. So that myriad of groups trying to get them to work together through institutions has proven too much.
So what's the strategy now?
I don't believe there is a strategy now. If there were, we would see it. What we've actually seen is a scramble to get out. And that, frankly, is not good enough. We as NATO, as the West, we need to have a far better proposition of who our militaries are, who our political strategists are, how they deploy economic power, aid power, military power, and many other systems of bringing countries into our sphere of influence. All of that seems to have collapsed. And one is hopeless in a sense to kind of point to a strategy today, except that the other side they had a strategy. They've implemented it. One of the top experts in the UK, Dr. Mike Martin, said the other day that this is a brilliant insurgency campaign of historic proportions that the Taliban have executed. And the question really isn't what the Taliban have done well. The question is what have we done badly in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and now Afghanistan.
The question is, what do we do now? Boris Johnson's currently chairing a COBRA meeting. Our political editor's outside. We're hoping to find out more details from that. What do you want to hear from him?
On the way here, I listened to The World at One. And one of the directors of UNICEF in Afghanistan was speaking about her relationship as the head of UNICEF with the Taliban over the last few years in giving girls access to education and schooling, and how they have a signed agreement with the local Taliban to continue that now that the Taliban are in charge, except they've asked for a pause whilst they inform their rank and file that girls not only are allowed to go to school, they should go to school. So we're seeing a very different flavour of the Taliban emerging. How long that stays, we don't know.
Do you have confidence that's actually going to be the case?
I've not been on the ground very much, well, not at all for the last 6 years. But in my time in the army, especially in my last 3.5 years working in the counterinsurgency centre, I met in my numerous trips to Afghanistan about 30 individual members of the Taliban in various locations across the country, and had discussions with them. Some of them are inside Kandahar prison itself. And in those discussions, it became very clear that firstly, the majority of them have had almost no exposure to any other way of living than what they experienced themselves in Afghanistan. And we must think what Afghanistan is. It's not a state like we have. It's a rural society, largely based on local farming. There are some light industries there, but not very much, no heavy industry at all. So largely people living a subsistence lifestyle, receiving almost no services from the government. Then the government turns up and says, right, here are our tanks and our machine guns and our helicopters, and we're going to tell you what to do. And that proposition hasn't worked for the majority of Afghans. The Taliban have come in and said, look, don't listen to those guys, listen to us. And in that competition of narratives, the Taliban seem to have had they've gained the upper hand in that competition, resulting in not only a catastrophic collapse of the armed forces of Afghanistan, but also the political leadership where the president ran away. So when that happens, we can't impose a governor of Afghanistan from London or Washington. We have to turn to the Afghans themselves. And if the reality on the ground today is that the dominant political force is the Taliban, then the question for us is, how do we deal with them? What do we do? These are the big questions we have to answer.
But also, if you're a primary school age girl in Afghanistan right now, what does your immediate future look like?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I would imagine that in the majority of cases, the Taliban will try to keep things going as they are. They don't want insurrection from the masses of people, because don't forget there are 40 million Afghans and maybe 100, 200,000 Taliban. So on that issue, they need to have consent of the people to be able to govern them. All of what we are witnessing from the Taliban sort of public relations team is designed to influence us in the West that, don't worry, we're going to be okay. But the proof has got to be in the tasting of the pudding, not just looking at it.
Is this a war we could ever have actually won when we've got the insurgents were being aided, resourced and abetted by our allies in Pakistan?
No, because in my academic studies, I looked at about 30 insurgencies the world over, and there are about 14 indicators which indicate whether the security forces, either government is going to win or the insurgency is going to win. And I'll just run through a couple of them. So, for example, cultural affinity with the mass of the population. So the Taliban are Afghans, they're Pashtuns, they speak Pashto, they're from the people. The Afghan army was largely Tajik, Dari speaking, and from the north, and supported by foreigners. The foreigners, of course, us, were completely foreign and didn't speak the languages and so on. So that gave the Taliban an advantage. If you have places where you can disappear to, like in Scotland in the 16th century, you can hide off in the mountains, or with any mountain-based guerrilla organisation is going to, in the end, win, because they've got places of sanctuary. They're in elevated positions, so when they are then attacked, they can defend more effectively. We saw that in Vietnam, for example, with the jungles. We see that with terrorist groups like in ETA and in the Basque Country. And so with these sorts of groups, if they've got refuge where they can get to, and of course the border, or the Durand line, it's not really even an international border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, has been completely porous. And my last sort of study of it, this was 2012, 80,000 people a day were crossing that border without control. So reinforcements were easy. and then logistics, supply chains. When we were often engaged in combat with the Taliban, we would have our body armor, our helmets, water bottles, first aid kits, 20 magazines full of ammunition, 9 kilograms rifle, and so much other kit like radios and so on. And they would have one rifle, a handful of magazines, maybe half a kilogram of sultanas, and they'd have weapons caches hidden, they'd have water supply hidden, so they were much more physically mobile than often we were. So these sorts of advantages give the insurgent force the upper hand. And so history has shown that where there's mountains and these sorts of scenarios, it is not possible for a security force to win through military force. And that's actually our own doctrine, because we rely on Galula, the French counterinsurgency theorist, who said that counterinsurgency strategy should be 80% politics, 20% military. And in my documentation of NATO's engagement in Afghanistan, it was the reverse. I would say probably 95% military and maybe 5% political. Depressing, I'm sorry.
It is. It is.
And for all the, I was in the army 11 years. My platoon commander from Sandhurst was killed in the same summer. One summer I was in Afghanistan. A very good friend of mine, his younger brother, Corporal Jabran Hashmi, a British Pakistani Muslim who went back to Afghanistan. He's Pashto speaker himself. Went to Afghanistan to help the people there. Was killed. Many other colleagues have been killed. I mentored 2 amputees who are good friends of mine. So, the heartache that we feel as the military community is extraordinary. But at some point, we've got to take a deep breath, look at the situation, understand the geostrategic vital importance of Afghanistan to global security, global economic pressures, and also our own issues of how refugees are now going to exit the country and how many of them are going to arrive in dinghies on the coast of Kent. And how do we vet those people? So all these longer-term challenges that are going to start hitting us. So we do need a very light-footed and assertive response immediately to this crisis.
The pictures we're looking at there are people absolutely desperately trying to flee, to get away.
Yes.
From the Taliban's perspective now, what are they going to do? What's their strategy in terms of building relations with the West? What kind of relationship do they want?
I haven't spoken to anyone from the Taliban in these few days, or even the last 6 years, I must say. I've only ever spoken to them as a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. So I don't know what they actually want. I can only go on what the publicly available information is. So the Taliban is made up of disparate groups. The ones who are sitting in Doha, who've been in direct negotiations with the US government led by Donald Trump to bring this war to an end, they are the sort of diplomats in the old school, Quetta Shura, sort of 1990s Taliban. But then there's Taliban commanders on the ground. And if you're a 25 to 28-year-old Taliban commander on the ground, all you've ever known is foreign occupation of your country. If you were born in and around when 9/11 happened, you won't necessarily be aware of that event. And so for many of the Afghans themselves, they're looking now to see this new government that's arisen over us. What are they going to do for us? And if one thing they stop doing is tyranny, then that'll be a big plus for the Afghan population. And we mustn't forget something very interesting, which is that how did the Taliban come to be? That's almost never discussed when we discuss these things like what does the word Taliban mean? It means students. They're a student movement. So it comes from the Arabic talaba, which is to seek knowledge, and Taliban is a Persian plural pattern, so students. And so Mullah Omar ran a small school with about 20 students. The local police in 1995 or whatever, 1996, had kidnapped a group of young boys for sexual predatory abuse, which was common amongst the police back in the 1990s and more recently. And the villagers went to the local school and said to this teacher, Mullah Omar, please help us get our children back. So he took his students, they beat the police up, they took the kids and rescued them. And that happened again and again. And that's how the Taliban movement was born. Now, of course, we're the first to say they went far too sort of medieval in terms of how they dealt with women's issues and
well, they were vigilantes, weren't they?
Absolutely, and lots of armed groups. See, one of the difficulties for us in the West is we have abdicated all our policing and security duties to the state. If somebody attacks me, I'm not going to go to the house and make revenge. Whereas in rural communities all over the world, in Afghanistan, more than perhaps anywhere else, if there's an act against you or your family, then revenge kicks in. So in those acts of revenge, we see all sorts of atrocities taking place. Normally they're hidden, but in the Taliban era, they came to prominence because they were a part of the Taliban organization. So the Taliban we're seeing today I think, are open to being shaped by us, but we must find mechanisms to engage them. We must find mechanisms that they can feel, right. If this person tells us something, we should listen to it. And of course, that's not going to be someone like me, clean-shaven British Muslim former army officer who's going to turn up there and tell them what to do. But there are other people in the world who we have influence over, who could influence them. So it's all to play for. It is not we haven't just lost and it's done. Afghanistan is there. 40 million people are there. The state is there. Russia and China are enjoying very good relationships with the Taliban leadership. The Americans do too, of course, which is how they've negotiated this ending of the war, and a ceasefire, I think, has been in place for a couple of years. So it is. Whilst there's a lot of doom and gloom, I think there is potential for hope, but we must engage with it. We can't just be sort of lazy and say, well, we lost, what's it all for? And we owe it to our own national pride. We owe it to long-term NATO security, and we owe it as a tribute to everyone who died and was injured in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Thank you very much for just sharing some of your insight and analysis. Really appreciate your time, Afzal Amin, former officer in the British Army for 11 years, spent 3 years particularly focusing on counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.